A young mother of two was found dead inside her own beauty salon. Police looked at suspect after suspect, checking nearly everyone in their small town, but every lead seemed to hit a dead end. For 10 years, the case went nowhere, until a chain of completely unexpected events suddenly brought it back to life and finally revealed the truth no one had seen coming. Dana Satterfield was born on November 16, 1967, in Spartanburg, South Carolina. She grew up in a close religious family, and people who knew her described her as warm, kind, and easy to love. Dana had a way of making friends wherever she went, and when someone needed help, she was the kind of person who would show up without thinking twice. She was also drawn to the beauty industry and everything connected to it. After high school, Dana trained to become a hairstylist and started working in local salons. She seemed to take to the work naturally, and over time, it became clear to her that this was the career she wanted to build. By then, she was living in a small town called Roebuck, right next to her hometown. Almost immediately after graduating from high school, Dana married a man named Mike, and they eventually had 2 children together, a daughter and a son. For several years, Dana saved money so she could open a small salon of her own, and eventually she made that dream happen. But running the business and keeping it alive took almost all of her time and energy. By the summer of 1995, Dana was 27 years old and still working at her hair salon, trying to balance the demands of her business with raising 2 children. On July 31st, at around 8:30 p.m., police received a call. A woman named Diane said she had been standing near Dana's salon, waiting for a ride, when she suddenly heard strange sounds coming from inside. The lights were off, but she could hear dull thuds from somewhere in the building. Then came a loud crash, and Diane saw a man jump out through the window. Diane knew Dana, so she immediately decided to report what she had seen. Just a few hours earlier, at around 6:30 p.m., she had gone into Dana's salon and sold her some cleaning supplies. Then, about 20 minutes before calling police, Diane had passed by the salon again, and at that point, the lights were still on. She had even seen Dana through the window, cleaning up inside, and Dana had waved to her. So when Diane later saw the lights off and the man jumping from the window, she thought Dana must have already gone home and that someone had broken into the salon. Since she didn't have a cell phone, she ran into a nearby store to call 911. To her surprise, almost right behind her came the same man she had just seen jumping out of the salon window. He looked at her, then left, and Diane called the police. An officer who happened to be nearby arrived at the salon, expecting to handle what looked like a small break-in. But what he found was far beyond anything he could have expected. When he entered the salon, he began searching it with a flashlight, and at first nothing seemed obviously out of place. But then he stepped into the back room and found Dana. Part of her clothing was missing, and her body was covered in scrapes. But that was not the most horrifying detail. There was a belt around her neck, and the other end had been tied to a water heater, leaving her body slightly raised off the floor. The officer immediately called for backup, and police began processing the scene. Because the town was so small, they recognized Dana right away, and since some of her clothing was missing, investigators believed the attacker may have sexually assaulted her. At the same time, detectives quickly ruled out robbery as a motive. Cash and other valuables were still inside the salon, and the scene itself was far too brutal to look like a random break-in. To investigators, it pointed more toward something very personal. While crime scene technicians searched the salon for fingerprints or biological evidence, officers took Diane's statement. They had little doubt that the man who had jumped out of the window was the killer, and because Diane had crossed paths with him again inside the store, she had managed to get a brief look at his face. Based on her description, police were able to create a composite sketch. He was a young white man, about 5 feet 9 inches tall, wearing a gray t-shirt and jeans. But even in a town that small, she did not recognize him. Diane sold cleaning products and was constantly walking around the area, offering them to people, so she knew many of the locals. But this man was someone she had never seen before. Police immediately distributed the sketch throughout the area and began searching nearby streets for the killer, but none of it led anywhere. They also looked through Diane's appointment book and saw that her last scheduled client that evening had come in several hours before she was killed. Based on Diane's statement, about 20 minutes before the attack, Dana had been cleaning the salon, apparently getting ready to close. So investigators believe the killer must have entered the salon and attacked her almost immediately, then dragged her into the back room and tied her to the water heater. As crime scene technicians examined the room, they found one single fingerprint on that water heater. Since the killer had tied the belt to it, he almost certainly had to touch its surface, so investigators believe the print belonged to the person who killed Dana. Police began looking into the people closest to Dana and learned that not long before the murder, she and her husband had started living separately, though they had not filed for divorce. Officers asked him for his fingerprints, and forensic experts quickly determined that the print found on the water heater belonged to him. But the idea that he may have been involved in the murder began to fall apart almost right away. When detectives spoke with Mike, he said that he had been watching the children that evening. His daughter and son, who were 8 and 6 years old, confirmed that their father had not left the house. On top of that, Mike did not match the witness's description of the man she had seen. He was a big guy, and police had a hard time believing he could have climbed out through the salon window. After speaking with Dana's loved ones, investigators learned that she and Mike really had been having problems in their marriage and were living apart. But everyone told them the same thing. The two were still on decent terms and were even trying to save the marriage for the sake of their children. Finally, Mike agreed to take a polygraph test, and the examiner found no signs of deception. Mike explained that he had personally installed the water heater where his print had been found, and that he occasionally repaired it, along with other things around the salon. So before long, detectives ruled Mike out as a suspect and went back to trying to figure out who had really killed Dana. But before long, forensics reported that they had found another print in the salon, this one left in blood. DNA testing showed that the blood belonged to Dana, which meant the fingerprint itself almost certainly had to belong to the killer. But it was not in any database, and when investigators compared it to the people in Dana's life, they found no match. A few days later, investigators received the autopsy report, and it confirmed just how violent the attack had been. Dana had been strangled, and her body was covered in bruises and scrapes, apparently from being punched repeatedly. Experts also confirmed that she had been sexually assaulted and recovered biological evidence from the attacker. But at the time, the FBI's DNA database was not yet up and running, so detectives could not simply upload the sample and wait for a hit. The only thing they could do was collect samples from potential suspects and compare them to the killer's DNA, one by one. Police began collecting DNA from different men, but none of it led anywhere. That went on for several days until a new witness came forward. A man named Ken said that on the night of the murder, he had driven past Dana's salon and noticed something strange. First, he saw that the lights inside the salon were off, but Dana's car was still parked outside. The second thing Ken noticed was a strange man standing near a white and blue Ford Bronco, parked beside a neighboring business. The problem was, Ken worked at that very place, and he knew it was already closed. So seeing an unfamiliar man in the parking lot struck him as odd. The man also looked nervous, and he stared at him in a tense, aggressive way until Ken drove past. According to Ken, this happened at around 8:40 p.m., which meant it was already after the murder. So now, police had a possible lead on the kind of vehicle the killer may have been driving. Of course, they could not be sure the man Ken had seen was actually connected to the crime, but at that point, it was essentially the only lead they had. They began looking into the owners of similar vehicles, and a few suspicious names did come up. But while police could not completely rule those people out, they also had no way to prove any of them were guilty. Months went by like that, and with every passing day, detectives began to doubt more and more that they would ever catch the person responsible. For the people in town, the situation was painful too. They knew a brutal killer could be living among them, and police still could not find him. People tried to help however they could. Every so often, someone would call 911 after spotting a Ford Bronco that looked like the same one police were searching for. Even Dana's children knew what kind of vehicle investigators were looking for, so whenever they saw one, they would tell their father. But none of it led anywhere, until the case suddenly got an unexpected break. Several months after the murder, when the investigation had already gone almost completely cold, police received a call from the jail. An inmate told them that his cellmate, Russell Quinn, might have been involved in Dana's murder. According to the cellmate, Russell often talked about knowing Dana and kept saying how beautiful she had been. The inmate also claimed Russell had a photograph of her, and that at one point he had even admitted he was the one who had killed her. Police began looking into Russell and learned that he had been free at the time Dana was murdered. He was now in jail for sexual assault, and detectives immediately noticed one very specific detail. In that case, Russell had tied his victim to a tree, and as we remember, Dana had been tied to a water heater. Investigators also learned that Russell drove a similar vehicle, and he looked very much like the composite sketch of the killer. Finally, they took his photograph, added 5 photos of other men, and showed the lineup to Diane, the witness who had seen the killer. After looking at the picture, she pointed to Russell and said he was the man she had seen. Detectives immediately sent Russell's DNA to the lab to compare it with the sample recovered from Dana's killer, but the results were not what they expected. Russell was not a match. Police had been almost certain he was involved, but just like that, one of their strongest leads was gone. After that, there was almost no movement in the case. Over time, it went cold completely. With each passing year, Dana's loved ones lost more and more hope that her killer would ever be caught, and even her children no longer believed justice would come. That went on for 10 years. By then, Dana's daughter, Ashley, was 18 and had started college. One day, she stopped at an auto shop for a routine oil change, and that ordinary stop would end up bringing her mother's case back to life. While Ashley stood outside waiting for her car, one of the mechanics told his coworkers that she looked a lot like Dana, the woman who had been killed 10 years earlier. They told him that Ashley was Dana's daughter, and the mechanic was stunned. He had not even known Dana had children. After that, he could not stop thinking about it. He felt guilty, not because he had anything to do with Dana's murder, but because he may have known the name of the person who did. 10 years earlier, when the mechanic was 17, he had called police anonymously and told them that Dana's murder may have been committed by another 17-year-old named Jonathan Vick. At the time, police had looked into Jonathan and learned that his mother owned a white and blue Ford Bronco, and that on the night of the murder, Jonathan had been driving it. But his mother flatly refused to let police speak with her son or examine the vehicle. She insisted he had nothing to do with what happened and demanded they leave her family alone. Police tried to get a warrant to collect Jonathan's DNA and fingerprints, but the judge refused to sign it based only on an anonymous phone call, so investigators had no choice but to back off. Now, 10 years later, that same mechanic was calling again. He repeated everything he had told police back then, and once again asked to remain anonymous. But officers explained that unless he was willing to give his name and make an official statement, there was only so much they could do. Michael understood that if he wanted to help get justice for Dana, he could not stay anonymous anymore. So this time, he put his name behind the story. He was 27 years old now, and he told police everything he knew. According to Michael, on the night of the murder, his friend Jonathan had given him a ride home in his mother's white and blue Ford Bronco. During the drive, Jonathan suddenly said he was planning to get his hair done that night. Michael thought that was strange since it was already late, but Jonathan told him he was going there for Dana, not for the haircut. He had been to that salon many times before, just like his mother, so both of them knew Dana. Then, Jonathan started talking about how beautiful she was, and how he wanted to have sex with her. Michael thought he was joking, since Jonathan was 10 years younger than Dana, so he just smirked. But Jonathan took it badly and snapped back with something like, "You don't think I can do it?" At the time, Michael still believed his friend was kidding, so he let the conversation drop. The next day, when the news reported Dana's murder, Michael refused to believe his friend could have had anything to do with it. But once police announced they were looking for a white Ford Bronco, he began to realize Jonathan really might have been involved. Things got even worse after the two of them met up, and Jonathan told him he would kill him if he ever told anyone about that night. That was why Michael decided to call police anonymously. He was afraid for his life, but at the same time, he could not keep carrying that information. 10 years later, it was Dana's children who finally pushed him to come forward. After thinking about what it must have been like for them to grow up without their mother, Michael pushed through his fear and decided to give up his anonymity. Now that police had a witness, the judge signed a warrant to collect Jonathan's DNA. By then, Jonathan was living in Greenville, about a half-an-hour drive from the place where Dana had been killed. In the years since the murder, he had served 2 years in the Marine Corps, and he now had a wife and daughter. But he had never managed to hold down steady work because he kept getting fired over his attitude. He clashed with coworkers, started conflicts, and refused to listen to his supervisors. At the same time, Jonathan did not have a serious criminal record. He had been arrested twice, once for vandalism and once for domestic violence. But in both cases, the charges were dropped. Police collected his DNA, and before long, forensic experts confirmed it. The semen recovered from Dana's body belonged to Jonathan. He denied having anything to do with the murder and insisted he had not even known the victim. But the evidence spoke for itself. When Jonathan was arrested and officers walked him to the car in front of reporters' cameras, he said, "I love my wife and my daughter. That's all that matters." Throughout the questioning that followed, he continued to deny any involvement in Dana's murder, so investigators moved forward and prepared the case for trial. Based on everything they had learned, detectives believed they could finally piece together what happened that night. Jonathan had gone to Dana's salon, just as he had told Michael he would. Most likely, he used the haircut as an excuse to get inside. Then, at some point, he made some kind of sexual advance. Dana may have thought he was joking at first, or she may have simply turned